Hey there, and welcome to another dive into history's darker corners. Tonight, we're exploring something that might make you uncomfortable, and honestly, it should. We're going beyond the obvious horrors everyone knows about the Holocaust and examining something that gets overlooked in textbooks and documentaries, something that reveals just how systematically dehumanizing the experience really was. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment and let me know. There's something both humbling and necessary about connecting across time zones to discuss these stories that demand to be remembered. And if this kind of historical exploration resonates with you, consider subscribing. We have many more untold stories waiting in the shadows. Now settle in. What we're about to discuss isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how hatred operates, how it spreads, and why recognizing these patterns matters more than ever in 2025. When most people think about why it sucked to be Jewish during the Holocaust, they immediately think of the camps, the gas chambers, the systematic murder of 6 million people. And they're right. Those are the ultimate horrors, the endpoint of Nazi ideology made manifest. But tonight, we're going to examine something that happened before the cattle cars, before the yellow stars, before the ghettos. Something that was arguably more insidious because it was so gradual, so seemingly reasonable, so wrapped in the language of science and progress that many people didn't even recognize it as the beginning of genocide. Tonight we're talking about how the Nazis didn't just kill Jewish bodies, they methodically destroyed Jewish time itself. You see, one of the most overlooked aspects of Nazi persecution was their systematic erasure of Jewish temporal existence. Not just their future, which was obviously being eliminated, but their past, and even their present. The Nazis understood something that modern historians are only beginning to fully appreciate: that controlling how a people experience time is one of the most effective ways to destroy their identity completely. Think about it. In 2025, we live in an age where our relationship with time is already complicated. We document everything, archive our memories in clouds, create digital timelines of our existence. We have ancestry websites that trace our lineage back centuries, DNA tests that connect us to ancient populations, social media platforms that create permanent records of our daily thoughts and experiences. Our sense of self is deeply intertwined with our ability to place ourselves in a continuous narrative, stretching from past to future. Now imagine all of that being systematically stripped away. The Nazis began this temporal destruction years before the first concentration camp was built. It started with something as mundane as record keeping. In 1933, immediately after coming to power, the Nazi government began what they called racial registration. But this wasn't just about identifying who was Jewish. It was about rewriting the historical record to erase Jewish contributions to German society. They went through archives, libraries, university records, business documents, newspaper files, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds. Anywhere a Jewish name appeared in a position of achievement, influence, or integration into German society, it was either removed entirely or marked with special notations that transformed the person from a German citizen with a religion into a foreign element that had somehow infiltrated German purity. Dr. Sarah Klein, whose family had been prominent physicians in Berlin for 4 generations, suddenly found her grandfather's medical innovations attributed to his German colleagues. The hospital wing named after her great-grandfather was renamed. Medical journals were reprinted with her family's contributions simply omitted. It wasn't enough to exclude Jews from future German society. The Nazis needed to prove they had never truly belonged in the first place. But the temporal destruction went deeper than just revising historical records. The Nazis systematically dismantled Jewish ritual time, the sacred calendar that had organized Jewish life for millennia. Synagogue services were first restricted, then banned entirely. The Hebrew calendar, with its cycle of holidays and observances that connected Jews to their ancestors and their God, was declared incompatible with German civic time. Imagine being told that the rhythms that have organized your family's life for generations, the holidays your grandmother taught you, the weekly cycle of preparation and rest that shapes your understanding of existence itself, are now illegal. Not just discouraged or socially unacceptable, but criminal acts that could result in imprisonment or worse. In 2025, we talk a lot about cultural appropriation and the importance of preserving indigenous traditions. We understand that when colonizers destroy native ceremonies, languages, and temporal practices, they're not just changing customs, they're severing people from their sense of identity and continuity. The Nazis understood this too. They knew that destroying Jewish time was as effective as destroying Jewish bodies, and in many ways more cruel, because it could be done gradually, bureaucratically, without the obvious brutality that might provoke resistance. The assault on Jewish time extended to the most personal level. Jewish children were forbidden from learning Hebrew, the language that connected them to their textual tradition stretching back thousands of years. Bar and bat mitzvahs, the ceremonies that marked a young person's entry into Jewish adulthood and responsibility, were banned. Jewish couples couldn't have religious wedding ceremonies. Jewish families couldn't observe mourning rituals for their dead. Each of these prohibitions might seem minor compared to the physical violence that would come later, but together they created a form of temporal exile that was devastating in its completeness. Jews were being cut off, not just from their future, but from their ability to maintain continuity with their past. They were being forced to exist in a permanent, disconnected present, stripped of the cultural practices that gave meaning to the passage of time. Sarah Goldstein, a survivor who was 16 when the war began, later wrote about this temporal destruction in her memoirs. They didn't just take our homes and our businesses, they took our holidays, our songs, our stories. We couldn't celebrate our children becoming adults, couldn't mourn our dead properly, couldn't mark the seasons the way our people had for thousands of years. We became a people without time, floating in an endless, meaningless now. The Nazis also understood that controlling access to information was crucial to temporal destruction. Jewish newspapers were shut down first, then Jewish access to any publications was restricted. Libraries purged books by Jewish authors. Jewish students were expelled from universities where they might have learned about their own history and culture. Jewish teachers were fired, ensuring that Jewish knowledge couldn't be passed to the next generation. This information control created what historians now call enforced historical amnesia. Jewish families found themselves unable to research their own genealogies, unable to access the documents that proved their deep roots in German society, unable to pass on the stories and knowledge that had sustained their communities for centuries. Compare this to our world in 2025, where access to information is considered a fundamental human right. We can research our family histories online, access digitized records from around the world, connect with distant relatives through DNA matching. The idea that a government could systematically prevent people from accessing information about their own heritage seems almost impossible in our hyper-connected age. But the Nazis didn't need to destroy all records. They just needed to make them inaccessible to Jews while maintaining them for their own purposes. Jewish family documents were confiscated and stored in special archives, where they could be used to track down hidden assets or identify people trying to hide their heritage. But the families themselves were denied access to their own histories. The temporal destruction extended to economic time as well. Jewish businesses weren't just seized, their histories were rewritten. A bakery that had been in a Jewish family for 5 generations would be transferred to German ownership, and all records of Jewish ownership would be altered to suggest the business had always been German. The new owners would claim credit for recipes, techniques, and relationships that Jewish families had developed over decades. Professional licenses were revoked not just going forward, but retroactively. Jewish doctors found that their medical degrees were declared invalid, their years of practice erased from official records. Jewish lawyers discovered that cases they had won, precedents they had established, were being attributed to their German colleagues or simply removed from legal records entirely. This wasn't just theft, it was temporal genocide. The Nazis were systematically erasing the evidence that Jews had ever contributed to German society, making it impossible for future generations to understand the depth of Jewish integration and achievement in pre-war Germany. The destruction of Jewish time also had a profound psychological impact that we're only beginning to understand today. Human beings are temporal creatures. Our sense of identity depends on our ability to place ourselves in a continuous narrative that stretches from our ancestral past through our present experience toward an imagined future. When that continuity is broken, when people are cut off from their temporal moorings, it creates a form of existential disorientation that can be more damaging than physical violence. Modern psychology recognizes this phenomenon in refugees and displaced populations. People who are forced to abandon their cultural practices, their languages, their community connections often experience what researchers call temporal displacement disorder. They lose their sense of where they fit in the flow of time, their confidence in their own memories, their ability to plan for the future. The Nazis systematically inflicted this condition on Jews throughout occupied Europe. They created a population of people who were temporarily homeless, cut off from their past and forbidden from imagining a future. This temporal destruction made physical resistance more difficult because it undermined the very sense of identity and continuity that motivates people to fight for their survival and that of their children. In our current moment, we're seeing echoes of these temporal destruction tactics in various forms around the world. Authoritarian governments still understand the power of controlling historical narratives, restricting access to information, and disrupting cultural practices that connect people to their heritage. The methods have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains the same. Destroy people's sense of temporal continuity, and you destroy their resistance to oppression. The difference is that in 2025, we have tools and awareness that didn't exist in the 1930s. We can document and preserve information in ways that are much harder to control or destroy. We can maintain cultural connections across vast distances. We can resist temporal destruction by consciously preserving and transmitting our stories, our practices, our sense of continuity with the past, and hope for the future. But we also face new forms of temporal destruction that the Nazis could never have imagined. Social media algorithms that manipulate our perception of time and history. Information warfare that makes it difficult to distinguish between authentic historical records and fabricated ones. The pace of technological change that can make entire ways of life obsolete in a single generation. Understanding how the Nazis used temporal destruction as a weapon of genocide isn't just about honoring the memory of Holocaust victims. It's about recognizing the patterns of oppression that continue to operate in our world today, often in subtler but equally devastating forms. The systematic erasure of Jewish time during the Holocaust represents one of history's most complete attempts to destroy a people not just physically, but existentially. It shows us how hatred operates not just through violence, but through the patient, bureaucratic destruction of meaning itself. As we continue exploring this topic, we'll examine how these temporal destruction tactics played out in specific communities, how some people managed to resist them, and what the long-term consequences have been for Holocaust survivors and their descendants. We'll also look at how understanding these patterns can help us recognize and resist similar tactics being used today against various communities around the world. Because the most important lesson of the Holocaust isn't just that systematic murder is evil. It's that genocide begins long before the killing starts, in the quiet destruction of people's sense of who they are and where they belong in the flow of time. And in 2025, as we face new challenges to human dignity and historical truth, that lesson has never been more relevant. The systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence became even more insidious when we examine how the Nazis weaponized memory itself. They didn't just erase Jewish contributions from official records. They created an elaborate system of false memories designed to replace authentic Jewish experiences with fabricated narratives that supported Nazi ideology. This wasn't simply propaganda. It was something far more sophisticated and devastating. The deliberate implantation of alternative histories that would make Jews doubt their own memories and experiences. Nazi psychologists, working with anthropologists and historians, developed what they called memory reconstruction protocols, designed to confuse and disorient Jewish populations about their own past. In 2025, we understand how memory works differently than people did in the 1930s. We know that memory is malleable, that it can be influenced by suggestion, that repeated exposure to false information can actually change what people remember about their own experiences. We see this phenomenon in our current digital age, where deep fakes and AI-generated content can make us question what we've actually seen and experienced. The Nazis intuited these psychological principles decades before modern neuroscience proved them correct. They created elaborate disinformation campaigns specifically targeting Jewish communities, designed not just to spread lies about Jewish people to non-Jews, but to make Jews themselves question the truth of their own experiences and heritage. Consider the case of the Weiss family in Vienna. After the Anschluss in 1938, they found themselves subjected to a particularly cruel form of psychological warfare. Nazi officials didn't just confiscate their property, they presented the family with fabricated documents proving that their grandfather had been a criminal who had stolen the family business from its rightful German owners decades earlier. These documents were sophisticated forgeries, complete with fake witness testimonies, altered photographs, and counterfeit legal papers that had been artificially aged to appear authentic. The goal wasn't necessarily to convince other people that these lies were true. The goal was to make the Weiss family doubt their own memories of their grandfather, their own understanding of their family history, their own sense of legitimacy and belonging. Mrs. Weiss later described the psychological impact. They showed us papers that looked real, with my grandfather's signature, that said terrible things about him. We knew they were lies, but they were so detailed, so convincing. My youngest daughter began asking if maybe we had been wrong about grandfather, if maybe we had only remembered the good things. They were making us doubt our own memories, our own family stories. This technique was applied systematically across occupied Europe. Jewish families would be presented with evidence that their ancestors had been criminals, collaborators, or parasites. Children would be shown fabricated school records suggesting their parents had been poor students or troublemakers. Adults would be confronted with fake employment records claiming they had been fired for incompetence or theft. The cruelty was in the detail. Nazi forgers didn't create obviously false documents. They created plausible lies, stories that contained just enough truth to be believable, narratives that exploited normal human insecurities and doubts. They understood that most people have complicated relationships with their family histories, that everyone has ancestors who weren't perfect, that children often idealize their parents in ways that can be undermined by suggestion. In our current era of information warfare, we see similar tactics being used against various communities. Disinformation campaigns that don't just spread lies about targeted groups, but that are designed to make members of those groups doubt their own experiences and narratives. Social media manipulation that makes people question their own memories and perceptions. Deep, fake technologies that can make anyone appear to have said or done things they never actually said or did. The difference is that in 2025, we have some understanding of how these psychological attacks work, and we have tools to verify information and preserve authentic records. During the Holocaust, Jewish families had no way to fact-check the documents they were shown, no independent sources of information to confirm or deny the lies they were being told. The Nazis also understood that destroying Jewish temporal existence required attacking the transmission of memory from one generation to the next. They systematically separated Jewish children from their grandparents, recognizing that grandparents are often the primary carriers of family stories, cultural knowledge, and historical memory. Jewish children were first prohibited from visiting elderly relatives. Then elderly Jews were moved to separate housing, then to ghettos, then to camps. Each step in this process was presented as being for health reasons, security concerns, or administrative efficiency. But the cumulative effect was to sever the lines of memory transmission that had sustained Jewish communities for centuries. Imagine being a Jewish child in occupied Poland, forbidden from visiting your grandmother, who had been moved to a segregated section of the city. Your parents, stressed and frightened, might not have time or emotional energy to share the stories and traditions that your grandmother would have passed on naturally through daily interaction. The songs, the recipes, the family histories, the religious explanations, the cultural practices that would have been absorbed gradually through relationship were suddenly unavailable. This wasn't just cultural loss, it was temporal amputation. Children were being cut off from their own heritage in real time, watching their connection to the past being severed while being unable to do anything about it. Many Holocaust survivors report that one of their greatest regrets is how much they never learned from grandparents and elderly relatives who were taken away before they could pass on their knowledge. The Nazis paired this separation strategy with active indoctrination programs designed to replace Jewish temporal understanding with Nazi ideology. Jewish children who were allowed to remain in schools were subjected to curriculum that portrayed Jewish history as a series of parasitic intrusions into superior civilizations. They were taught that their ancestors had never created anything of value, had never contributed to human progress, had always been dependent on the labor and creativity of others. These lessons weren't presented as anti-Semitic propaganda. They were presented as objective historical fact, supported by carefully selected evidence and scholarly-sounding analysis. Children were shown maps that erased Jewish communities from historical timelines, texts that omitted Jewish contributions to science and culture, chronologies that portrayed Jewish presence in Europe as recent immigration rather than centuries-old settlement. The psychological impact of this educational assault was devastating. Children began to internalize shame about their heritage, to see their own families as somehow fraudulent or inferior. Some began to distance themselves from Jewish identity, hoping to escape the stigma they were being taught to associate with their own background. Sarah Rosen, who was 12 when the war began, later wrote, "They didn't just tell us we were inferior. They convinced us that our own memories were wrong, that the stories our families told us about our ancestors were lies we had told ourselves to feel better. I began to wonder if my grandfather really had been the respected teacher we remembered, or if we had just imagined his importance because we wanted to believe we mattered." This internalized temporal destruction was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Nazi psychological warfare against Jewish communities. They weren't just destroying Jewish bodies and property, they were destroying Jewish confidence in their own perceptions, their own memories, their own worth. They were creating a generation of Jewish children who would grow up doubting their own heritage and questioning their right to exist. The long-term consequences of this temporal destruction extended far beyond the war itself. Holocaust survivors often struggled to rebuild their sense of identity and continuity after liberation. Many found that they had lost not just their families and communities, but their confidence in their own memories and cultural knowledge. Survivors frequently reported feeling like imposters in their own heritage, uncertain about traditions they had once known intimately, unable to trust their own recollections of pre-war life. The systematic assault on Jewish temporal existence had created a form of cultural amnesia that persisted long after the physical persecution ended. This phenomenon helps explain why so many Holocaust survivors were initially reluctant to share their experiences, even with their own children. It wasn't just that the memories were traumatic. It was that the survivors themselves had been made to doubt the validity of their own experiences. They had been conditioned to see their own perspectives as unreliable, their own memories as potentially false. The recovery of Jewish temporal existence after the Holocaust required not just physical rebuilding, but psychological and cultural reconstruction. Survivors had to learn to trust their own memories again, to validate their own experiences, to reconnect with traditions and practices that had been systematically undermined during the Nazi years. This process of temporal recovery was complicated by the fact that many of the people who might have helped with this reconstruction, grandparents, teachers, religious leaders, community elders, had been murdered. The knowledge that had been passed down through generations had been deliberately severed, leaving survivors to piece together their heritage from fragments and half-remembered stories. In many ways, the Jewish communities that emerged after the Holocaust were temporarily orphaned. They had to rebuild their sense of continuity with the past, while simultaneously creating new traditions and practices that could sustain them in a world that had fundamentally changed. They had to learn to honor their ancestors while accepting that much of what those ancestors had created had been deliberately destroyed. Understanding this temporal dimension of Holocaust persecution helps explain why memory and documentation became so important to post-war Jewish communities. The emphasis on recording testimonies, preserving artifacts, building museums, and educating future generations wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was about reconstructing the temporal continuity that the Nazis had systematically destroyed. It also helps explain why Holocaust denial is so particularly painful for survivors and their descendants. It's not just that deniers are spreading lies about historical events. They're continuing the Nazi project of temporal destruction, attempting to sever the connections between past, present, and future that survivors worked so hard to rebuild. As we examine these patterns of temporal destruction, we can see how they continue to operate in various forms around the world today. The specific methods may have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains the same. Destroy people's sense of temporal continuity, and you destroy their ability to resist oppression and maintain their identity across generations. In 2025, we see echoes of these temporal destruction tactics manifesting in subtler but equally troubling ways. Social media algorithms curate our perception of history, feeding us information bubbles that can gradually reshape our understanding of past events. Deepfake technology makes it increasingly difficult to trust visual evidence. AI-generated content can create convincing false narratives about historical figures and events. The tools have evolved, but the underlying principle remains the same. Control how people understand time and memory, and you control their sense of identity and resistance. But there's another dimension to this temporal destruction that reveals just how thoroughly the Nazis understood human psychology. They didn't just attack Jewish memory and history. They systematically destroyed Jewish concepts of the future. This might sound abstract, but consider how fundamental future thinking is to human survival and meaning-making. We plan for tomorrow, save for retirement, plant trees we'll never sit under, teach our children skills they'll need as adults. We invest in education, build institutions, create art and literature for future generations. Our entire sense of purpose is often tied to our ability to imagine and work toward a better future. The Nazis understood this, and they weaponized it. Jewish children were systematically excluded from educational pathways that would have prepared them for adult careers. Not just universities, but trade schools, apprenticeships, professional development programs. The message was clear. There is no future for you to prepare for. Jewish families found themselves unable to make long-term financial plans, unable to invest in businesses or property, unable to secure their children's education. Every pathway to future security was systematically closed, but the cruelty went deeper than economic exclusion. The Nazis created what historians now call temporal claustrophobia. a deliberate compression of Jewish experience into an endless, hopeless present. Jews were forbidden from making long-term plans, from saving money for future needs, from investing in anything that extended beyond immediate survival. Consider the Kahn family in Frankfurt. Before 1933, they had been planning their daughter Rebecca's medical education, saving money for her university tuition, discussing which specialization might suit her talents. By 1935, Rebecca was forbidden from attending university. By 1937, the family's savings had been confiscated through special taxes and community contributions. By 1938, they were living day to day, unable to plan beyond the next meal, the next month's rent. Rebecca later wrote, "They didn't just take away my future as a doctor, they took away my ability to imagine any future at all." We stopped talking about next year, next month, even next week. We lived in a tiny bubble of now, always wondering if today would be the day they came for us. This temporal compression was psychologically devastating in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Modern research shows that people who lose their ability to imagine and plan for the future often develop symptoms similar to severe depression, hopelessness, loss of motivation, difficulty making decisions, inability to find meaning in daily activities. The Nazis systematically inflicted this condition on entire Jewish communities. They created a population of people who were temporarily trapped, unable to invest emotional energy in long-term goals, because those goals had been made impossible to achieve. Compare this to how marginalized communities today fight for their futures. Climate activists plant trees and organize for environmental policies they may not live to see implemented. Civil rights organizers work for changes that might take generations to fully realize. Community leaders invest in education and infrastructure that will benefit future generations. The ability to imagine and work toward a better future is fundamental to human resilience and resistance. The Nazis recognized this, which is why they systematically destroyed Jewish capacity for future thinking. They understood that people who cannot imagine a better tomorrow are much easier to control than people who are actively working toward change. The temporal compression extended to the most intimate aspects of Jewish life. Jewish couples were discouraged from having children, then forbidden from adopting children, then prevented from creating stable family structures that could nurture the next generation. The message was consistent: your lineage ends here. There is no Jewish future to plan for. Young Jewish adults found themselves in an impossible psychological position. They were at the age when people typically begin serious career planning, marriage preparation, family formation, all the activities that connect present choices to future outcomes. But every pathway to a normal adult future had been systematically blocked. Many responded by living with a strange intensity in the present moment, forming deep friendships and passionate relationships that might have to be abandoned at any time. Others retreated into despair, unable to motivate themselves to engage with a world that offered no hope for improvement. Still others channeled their frustrated future planning energy into resistance activities, using their organizational skills to help other Jews escape or survive. The psychological impact of this temporal compression often persisted long after liberation. Many Holocaust survivors struggled to make long-term plans even after moving to countries where they were safe and free. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to live in the immediate present that they found it difficult to trust that any future they planned would actually be allowed to unfold. Dr. Ruth Goldberg, a psychiatrist who worked with Holocaust survivors in the 1950s, noted, "Many of my patients had difficulty making simple decisions about their futures, whether to buy furniture, whether to enroll in educational programs, whether to have children. They had been so thoroughly trained to expect that any future they imagined would be taken away that they found it almost impossible to invest emotional energy in long-term planning." This future destruction also had profound effects on how survivors related to their children and grandchildren. Many struggled to encourage their children's ambitions and dreams, having been so thoroughly conditioned to expect that hope leads to disappointment. Others became almost frantically invested in their children's success, as if trying to compensate for the futures that had been stolen from their own generation. The systematic destruction of Jewish future thinking reveals another dimension of Nazi psychological warfare that we're seeing echoed in contemporary attacks on marginalized communities. When authoritarian movements want to destroy a group's resistance, they don't just attack their present circumstances. They attack their ability to imagine and work toward change. We see this in contemporary voter suppression efforts that make it difficult for certain communities to participate in electoral processes that might improve their circumstances. We see it in environmental policies that sacrifice long-term sustainability for short-term profits, effectively stealing the future from younger generations. We see it in educational funding cuts that prevent certain communities from developing the skills and knowledge they need to build better lives. The specific tactics may be different, but the underlying strategy remains the same. Destroy people's ability to imagine and work toward a better future, and you destroy their capacity for sustained resistance to oppression. In 2025, we also see how technology can be used for temporal destruction in ways the Nazis could never have imagined. Social media platforms that prioritize immediate engagement over long-term relationship building. Economic systems that force people to live paycheck to paycheck, unable to save or invest in their futures. Educational debt that traps young people in economic cycles that prevent them from making long-term plans. These modern forms of temporal compression may not be as overtly malicious as Nazi policies, but they can have similar psychological effects, creating populations of people who are so focused on immediate survival that they cannot organize effectively for long-term change. Understanding how the Nazis used temporal destruction as a weapon helps us recognize when similar tactics are being used today. It also helps us understand why protecting people's ability to imagine and work toward better futures is fundamental to maintaining human dignity and democratic resistance. The systematic assault on Jewish temporal existence during the Holocaust wasn't just about destroying Jewish people. It was about destroying the very possibility of Jewish futurity. The Nazis wanted to ensure that even if some Jews survived, they would be so temporally damaged that they could never rebuild their communities or challenge the Nazi narrative about Jewish inferiority. But they failed. Despite the systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence, survivors found ways to rebuild their sense of continuity with the past and hope for the future. They created new institutions, preserved what memories they could, and most importantly, they had children and grandchildren who carried forward both the trauma and the resilience of their experience. The recovery of Jewish temporal existence after the Holocaust required enormous courage and creativity. Survivors had to learn to trust in the possibility of a future again, to invest emotional energy in long-term goals despite having been conditioned to expect disappointment and loss. They did this through storytelling, through ritual, through community building, through education. They created Holocaust museums and memorials that connected past suffering to present responsibility. They established institutions that would ensure Jewish knowledge and culture could be transmitted to future generations. They raised children who would carry forward both the memory of what had been lost and the determination to prevent it from happening again. This process of temporal recovery wasn't just about healing from trauma, it was about resistance to genocide. By rebuilding their sense of continuity with the past and commitment to the future, Holocaust survivors were actively defeating the Nazi project of temporal destruction. The lessons of this temporal warfare extend far beyond Jewish experience during the Holocaust. They help us understand how oppression operates at the deepest psychological levels, how hatred can be weaponized through the manipulation of memory and time, and how resistance requires not just physical courage, but temporal courage, the willingness to remember the past honestly and work toward a better future despite uncertainty and risk. As we continue examining this overlooked dimension of Holocaust persecution, We'll explore how these temporal destruction tactics played out in specific locations and communities, how some people managed to preserve their sense of temporal continuity despite systematic assault, and what the long-term consequences have been for subsequent generations. We'll also examine how understanding these patterns can help us recognize and resist similar tactics being used against various communities today. Because the most important lesson isn't just that the Holocaust was uniquely terrible, but that the psychological and cultural mechanisms that made it possible continue to operate in various forms around the world. The destruction of Jewish temporal existence shows us that genocide begins not with killing, but with the systematic erosion of people's sense of who they are, where they come from, and where they're going. It begins with making people doubt their own memories, question their own worth, and abandon hope for their own futures. And in 2025, as we face new forms of information warfare, technological manipulation, and authoritarian control, understanding these patterns has never been more crucial for protecting human dignity and democratic values. The systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence reached its most insidious form in what Nazi administrators euphemistically called social time regulation, wo. This wasn't just about controlling when Jews could shop or work, though those restrictions were devastating enough. This was about destroying the very rhythm of Jewish social existence, the natural flow of human connection that makes life meaningful. Think about how time works in your daily life in 2025. You wake up, check your phone, see messages from friends, scroll through social media, maybe video call family members across the globe. Your day is punctuated by human connection, by the knowledge that you exist in a web of relationships that extend across space and time. You make plans with friends for next weekend. You remember conversations from last month. You maintain ongoing relationships that give your life continuity and meaning. Now imagine all of that being methodically stripped away. The Nazis didn't just segregate Jews physically, they destroyed their ability to maintain the social connections that make human existence bearable. Jewish families were forbidden from gathering for celebrations, even small ones. Birthday parties became illegal. Wedding anniversaries couldn't be observed. Children couldn't invite friends over to play. Adults couldn't meet for coffee or share meals with neighbors. But the cruelty went deeper than simple social isolation. The Nazis understood that human beings are fundamentally social creatures, that we develop our sense of self through interaction with others, that our memories and experiences only become real when we can share them with people who matter to us. They weaponized this understanding. Jewish families found themselves living in a strange form of social suspended animation. They were physically present in their communities but socially erased. Their neighbors were forbidden from acknowledging them. Their former friends were prohibited from maintaining contact. Their colleagues acted as if they had never existed. Sarah Brenner, a teacher in Vienna, described the psychological impact. It wasn't just that we couldn't go to the theatre or the cafe. It was that when I walked down the street where I'd lived for 20 years, people I had known since childhood would look right through me. My butcher, who had saved special cuts of meat for my family for a decade, would serve the person behind me as if I wasn't there. I began to feel like a ghost in my own life. This social erasure created what psychologists now recognize as a form of existential suffocation. Human beings need social validation to maintain their sense of reality. When that validation is systematically withdrawn, people begin to doubt not just their social worth but their actual existence. The Nazis paired this social isolation with deliberate social confusion. Jews were required to maintain certain social obligations while being forbidden from others. They had to pay taxes but couldn't vote. They had to follow traffic laws but couldn't use public transportation. They had to respect property rights, but their own property could be confiscated at any time. This created a disorienting social reality where Jews were simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, ignored and scrutinized, excluded and controlled. They existed in a kind of social limbo that made it impossible to understand their place in the world or plan for any kind of normal future. Compare this to how social isolation is used as a weapon today. We understand now that solitary confinement is a form of torture, that cutting people off from social connection can cause permanent psychological damage. We recognize that social media manipulation can be used to isolate people from their communities and make them vulnerable to radicalization. But the Nazi system of social time regulation was more sophisticated than simple isolation. It was designed to create maximum psychological confusion and distress by maintaining just enough social connection to remind Jews of what they had lost, while making it impossible to rebuild or maintain meaningful relationships. Jewish children were particularly vulnerable to this form of temporal destruction. Children develop their sense of identity through play, friendship, and social interaction. They learn how to be human by watching and imitating the adults around them, by forming relationships with peers, by participating in the social rituals that give life meaning. Nazi regulations systematically destroyed all of these developmental opportunities. Jewish children were forbidden from playing with non-Jewish children, excluded from schools and sports clubs, prohibited from attending concerts or movies, or any of the social activities that help young people develop into healthy adults. But the psychological assault went beyond simple exclusion. Jewish children were forced to watch their parents and grandparents being socially humiliated and erased. They saw their fathers, who had once been respected in their communities, being treated like criminals or outcasts. They watched their mothers, who had once been active in social organizations, being reduced to fearful isolation. Children are particularly sensitive to social hierarchy and status. They understand instinctively when their family's social position is being attacked. Jewish children during this period often internalize the message that their families deserved social rejection, that there was something inherently wrong with being Jewish that justified their isolation and humiliation. Rachel Goldschmidt, who was 8 when the Nuremberg laws were passed, later wrote, "I stopped inviting friends over because I was ashamed of how small our apartment had become after my father lost his job. I stopped talking about my family at school because the other children would get quiet and uncomfortable. I began to feel like my very existence was an embarrassment to everyone around me." This internalized shame was one of the most devastating consequences of social time regulation. Children who should have been developing confidence and social skills were instead learning to see themselves as social burdens, as people whose very presence made others uncomfortable. The long-term psychological consequences of this social temporal destruction were profound. Many Holocaust survivors struggled with social anxiety and depression long after the war ended. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to expect social rejection that they found it difficult to form new relationships or trust that they would be accepted in their new communities. Dr. Anna Freud, working with child survivors after the war, noted that many had developed what she called social hypervigilance, a constant state of anxiety about how others perceived them, an inability to relax in social situations, a tendency to interpret neutral social interactions as signs of rejection or hostility. This social trauma was passed down to subsequent generations in ways that researchers are still trying to understand. Children of Holocaust survivors often report feeling socially anxious or uncertain, having difficulty trusting that they truly belong in their communities, experiencing what they describe as inherited social paranoia. The destruction of Jewish social time also had profound effects on Jewish cultural transmission. Culture isn't just preserved in books or artifacts. It's transmitted through social interaction, through the casual conversations and shared experiences that happen when people gather together. When Jews were forbidden from gathering socially, when families couldn't celebrate holidays together, when communities couldn't maintain their traditional patterns of interaction, centuries of cultural knowledge began to disappear. Not just formal religious knowledge, but the informal wisdom that gets passed down through storytelling, through shared meals, through the kind of casual social interaction that the Nazis had made illegal. Elderly Jews, who would normally have been the repositories of cultural memory and community wisdom, found themselves isolated from the younger generations who needed their guidance. Young adults, who would normally have been learning how to form families and maintain communities, were cut off from the social networks that would have taught them these essential life skills. The result was a form of cultural amnesia that went beyond what could be recovered through books or formal education. The social knowledge that makes communities function, how to resolve conflicts, how to support each other through difficult times, how to maintain relationships across differences, was being lost because the social contexts where this knowledge was transmitted had been destroyed. In 2025, we're seeing similar patterns of social destruction affecting various communities around the world. Online harassment campaigns that isolate individuals from their social networks. Economic policies that force families to move frequently, disrupting community connections. Immigration policies that separate families and prevent the formation of stable social communities. The specific methods may be different, but the underlying principle remains the same. Destroy people's social connections, and you destroy their ability to maintain their identity and resist oppression across generations. Understanding how the Nazis used social time regulation as a weapon helps us recognize when similar tactics are being used today. It also helps us understand why protecting people's right to social connection and community formation is fundamental to maintaining human dignity and democratic values. The systematic assault on Jewish social time during the Holocaust wasn't just about making Jews miserable. It was about destroying their capacity to function as a coherent community that could preserve its heritage and resist oppression. The Nazis understood that people who are socially isolated are much easier to control than people who are embedded in strong, supportive communities. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this social temporal destruction was how it made Jews complicit in their own isolation. The regulations were designed so that maintaining social connections required breaking the law, putting both Jews and their non-Jewish friends at risk. A non-Jewish neighbor who wanted to help a Jewish family face potential imprisonment, loss of employment, or worse, a Jewish family that accepted help from non-Jewish friends was putting those friends in danger. The Nazi system was designed to make kindness itself a form of resistance that required enormous courage and sacrifice. This created a moral paradox that was psychologically devastating for everyone involved. Jews found themselves having to choose between protecting their friends and maintaining their social connections. Non-Jews found themselves having to choose between their own safety and their moral obligations to their neighbors. Many people on both sides of this equation chose safety over solidarity, not because they were cowards, but because the consequences of resistance were so severe. The result was a gradual erosion of the social bonds that had held German and Austrian communities together for generations. The Nazi system didn't just destroy Jewish social time, it poisoned the social fabric of entire societies. It taught non-Jews that abandoning their Jewish neighbors was not just acceptable, but necessary for their own survival. It created a culture of social cowardice that would have lasting effects long after the war ended. This social poisoning was one of the most lasting legacies of Nazi temporal destruction. Even after liberation, even after the establishment of new democratic governments, the social trust that had been destroyed during the Nazi years was extremely difficult to rebuild. Jewish survivors returning to their former communities often found that the social connections they had hoped to re-establish had been permanently severed. Non-Jewish neighbors who had remained silent during the persecution often felt too guilty to re-establish friendships. Jewish survivors often felt too hurt and betrayed to trust that their former friends had genuine intentions. The result was a form of social atomization that affected entire societies. Communities that had once been characterized by dense networks of social connection became collections of isolated individuals who had learned not to trust each other, not to take risks for each other, not to invest emotional energy in relationships that might be taken away. This social atomization made societies more vulnerable to future manipulation and control. People who don't trust their neighbors, who don't have strong community connections, who have learned to prioritize their individual safety over collective well-being, are much easier for authoritarian movements to manipulate and control. In 2025, we can see how social atomization continues to be a tool of political manipulation. Social media algorithms that create echo chambers and destroy opportunities for genuine dialogue across difference. Economic policies that force people to compete against each other rather than cooperate for mutual benefit. Political rhetoric that encourages people to see their neighbors as enemies rather than potential allies. The specific technologies may be different, but the underlying strategy remains the same. Destroy social trust and community connection, and you create populations that are vulnerable to authoritarian control and manipulation. Understanding how the Nazis used social temporal destruction as a weapon of genocide helps us recognize these patterns when they emerge in contemporary contexts. It also helps us understand why building and maintaining strong, inclusive communities is not just personally fulfilling, but politically essential for protecting democratic values and human dignity. The recovery of Jewish social time after the Holocaust required enormous courage and creativity. Survivors had to learn to trust again, to invest emotional energy in relationships that might be fragile, to rebuild communities that had been systematically destroyed. They did this through synagogues and community centers, through support groups and cultural organizations, through the simple act of gathering together to share meals and stories and memories. They created new traditions that honored their past while adapting to their new circumstances. But perhaps most importantly, they refused to let the Nazi assault on social time destroy their fundamental humanity. Despite everything they had experienced, despite all the reasons they had to mistrust and fear, they chose to reach out to each other, to form new connections, to rebuild the social fabric that gives life meaning. This process of social recovery wasn't just about healing from trauma, it was about resistance to genocide. By rebuilding their communities, by maintaining their social connections across generations, by refusing to remain isolated and atomized, Holocaust survivors were actively defeating the Nazi project of social destruction. The lessons of this social temporal warfare extend far beyond Jewish experience during the Holocaust. They help us understand how oppression operates at the community level, how hatred can be weaponized through the destruction of social connection, and how resistance requires not just individual courage, but collective solidarity. As we face new challenges to social cohesion and community connection in 2025, understanding these patterns becomes crucial for protecting the social foundations of democratic society. Because the most effective defense against temporal destruction isn't just individual resilience, it's the preservation and cultivation of the social connections that make human life meaningful and resistance possible. The systematic assault on Jewish temporal existence shows us that genocide is not just about killing people. It's about destroying the social, cultural, and psychological foundations that make human communities possible. And the most effective resistance to such destruction is the patient, courageous work of rebuilding and maintaining the connections that make us human. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of this temporal destruction was how the Nazis turned time itself into a weapon of terror through what they called uncertainty scheduling. This wasn't just about making Jews wait in endless lines or forcing them to report for labor at unpredictable hours, though those tactics were certainly part of it. This was about systematically destroying Jewish people's ability to predict or control any aspect of their temporal experience. In 2025, we understand how crucial predictability is to human psychological health. We know that people who can't predict basic aspects of their daily routine, when they'll eat, when they'll sleep, when they'll see their families, develop symptoms similar to those of torture victims. We recognize that uncertainty, when prolonged and extreme, can cause permanent psychological damage. The Nazis intuited these principles decades before modern psychology proved them correct. They created a system of temporal chaos specifically designed to break down Jewish psychological resistance through chronic uncertainty and unpredictability. Consider the experience of Dr. Ernst Levy, a prominent Berlin physician. Before 1933, his days followed predictable patterns: morning hospital rounds, afternoon consultations, evening meals with his family, weekend social gatherings. His life was organized around routine, structure, the comforting rhythm of professional and personal obligations that gave his existence meaning and direction. By 1938, Dr. Levy's temporal existence had been completely shattered. He might be summoned for registration at any hour of the day or night. His medical license could be revoked without warning. His patients could be forbidden from seeing him at a moment's notice. His family could be forced to relocate with only hours of preparation. Nothing in his life could be planned or predicted beyond the immediate moment. The psychological impact was devastating. Dr. Levy later wrote, "They didn't just take away my medical practice. They took away my ability to live like a human being. I couldn't make appointments because I didn't know if I'd be allowed to keep them. I couldn't plan meals because I didn't know if we'd have food or if we'd be permitted to buy it. I couldn't comfort my children because I couldn't promise them anything about tomorrow." This temporal chaos was systematically applied across all aspects of Jewish life. Jewish businesses might be shut down without warning, then reopened under different restrictions, then closed again. Jewish families might be told they had to move within 24 hours, then told the move was postponed, then given new moving instructions that contradicted the previous ones. The effect was to create a population of people who lived in a constant state of hypervigilance and anxiety, never able to relax, never able to plan, never able to develop the psychological stability that comes from routine and predictability. They became, in essence, temporal refugees in their own lives. Compare this to how uncertainty is used as a psychological weapon today. We see it in immigration policies that keep families in bureaucratic limbo for years, never knowing when they might be separated or deported. We see it in employment practices that use unpredictable scheduling to prevent workers from organizing or planning their lives. We see it in healthcare systems that create administrative chaos to discourage people from accessing services. The specific methods may have evolved, but the underlying principle remains the same. Destroy people's ability to predict and control their temporal experience, and you destroy their capacity to maintain psychological stability and resist oppression. The Nazis paired this temporal chaos with what they called temporal false hope, a particularly cruel form of psychological manipulation where Jews were given reason to believe their situation might improve, only to have those hopes systematically crushed. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was deliberate psychological warfare designed to maximize suffering and destroy resistance. Jewish families would be told that new regulations were temporary measures that would be lifted once the political situation stabilized. Jewish professionals would be informed that their licenses were suspended rather than revoked, implying they might someday be restored. Jewish students would be told they were temporarily excluded from universities, suggesting they might eventually be readmitted. These false hopes served multiple purposes. They prevented Jews from taking more drastic action to escape or resist, because people who believe their situation is temporary are less likely to make permanent changes. They also created a psychological roller coaster that was more damaging than consistent despair would have been. Modern psychology has confirmed what the Nazis understood intuitively, that intermittent reinforcement, giving people occasional reasons to hope while generally disappointing them, is one of the most effective ways to break down psychological resistance. It's the same principle that makes gambling addiction so powerful, that keeps people in abusive relationships, that allows authoritarian regimes to maintain control over populations that should, by all logic, rebel. Rebecca Stern, whose family spent 3 years believing they would eventually be allowed to emigrate to America, described the psychological impact. Every month, we were told the visa process was moving forward, that we just needed to wait a little longer, provide one more document, pay one more fee. We lived for 3 years in a state of constant preparation to leave, never able to settle into our restricted life because we believed it was temporary, never able to actually leave because the promises were empty. It was like being psychologically tortured with our own hope. This temporal false hope also served to isolate Jews from potential allies. People who believe their persecution is temporary are less likely to seek help from others, less likely to organize resistance movements, less likely to take the kinds of desperate action that might attract international attention. The Nazis understood that hope, when manipulated correctly, could be more effective than despair at keeping people passive and compliant. The systematic destruction of Jewish temporal predictability extended to the most intimate aspects of daily life. Families couldn't establish regular meal times because they never knew when food would be available or when they might be forced to leave their homes. Parents couldn't maintain bedtime routines for their children because raids and inspections might happen at any hour. Couples couldn't maintain intimacy because they never knew when they might be separated or when their privacy might be violated. This destruction of domestic temporal rhythm was particularly devastating because the home is where people typically find refuge from the chaos of the outside world. In normal circumstances, even people whose professional lives are unpredictable can find psychological stability through domestic routine, regular meals, consistent sleep schedules, predictable family interactions. The Nazis systematically destroyed this refuge. Jewish homes became spaces of temporal chaos where nothing could be counted on, where every routine could be disrupted without warning, where the basic rhythms that make domestic life possible were constantly under assault. Children were particularly vulnerable to this temporal chaos. Child development depends on routine and predictability. Children need to know when they'll eat, when they'll sleep, when they'll see their parents, when they'll be safe. Without these temporal anchors, children cannot develop the psychological security that allows them to learn, grow, and form healthy relationships. Jewish children during this period often developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of complex trauma: hypervigilance, difficulty concentrating, problems with attachment, inability to trust that adults could protect them. But these weren't just individual psychological problems. They were the intended consequences of a systematic assault on Jewish temporal existence. The Nazis understood that children who grew up without temporal security would be permanently damaged, less able to form stable families and communities, less capable of preserving and transmitting Jewish culture to future generations. The temporal chaos inflicted on Jewish children was designed to ensure that even if some Jews survived physically, they would be so psychologically damaged that they couldn't rebuild their communities. This intergenerational temporal destruction had consequences that extended far beyond the war itself. Many Holocaust survivors struggled to provide their own children with the temporal security they had been denied. Having grown up in chaos, they often found it difficult to establish the kind of predictable routines that help children feel safe and secure. Some survivors became obsessively controlling about time and routine, trying to create the predictability they had been denied during their childhood. Others found themselves unable to plan for the future or maintain consistent schedules, having been so thoroughly conditioned to expect that any routine would be disrupted. The children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors often report growing up with a sense that time was somehow dangerous, that making plans was risky, that routine could be shattered at any moment. This inherited temporal anxiety has been passed down through generations, affecting families decades after the original trauma occurred. In our current era, we're beginning to understand how temporal trauma can be transmitted across generations through both psychological and biological mechanisms. Epigenetic research suggests that extreme stress can actually alter gene expression in ways that affect offspring. Children of trauma survivors often inherit not just psychological symptoms, but actual biological predispositions to anxiety and hypervigilance. Understanding this intergenerational transmission of temporal trauma helps explain why the effects of the Holocaust extended so far beyond the immediate victims. The Nazis didn't just destroy the temporal existence of Jews who lived through the persecution. They damaged the temporal capacities of subsequent generations who would have to rebuild Jewish communities and culture. The recovery of Jewish temporal existence after the Holocaust required not just individual healing, but collective reconstruction of the temporal practices that make community life possible. Survivors had to learn to trust in routine again, to make plans for the future, to establish the kind of predictable rhythms that allow families and communities to function. They did this through religious observance, which provided structured temporal frameworks that connected them to their heritage and to each other. They did it through community organizations that created regular meeting times and shared activities. They did it through the simple act of establishing households where children could experience the temporal security that they themselves had been denied. But perhaps most importantly, they did it by refusing to let the Nazi assault on Jewish temporal existence prevent them from imagining and working toward a better future. Despite everything they had experienced, despite all the reasons they had to mistrust time and routine and planning, they chose to invest in temporal projects that extended beyond their own lives. They built institutions that would serve future generations. They created educational programs that would preserve Jewish knowledge and culture. They raised children and grandchildren who would carry forward both the memory of temporal destruction and the determination to protect temporal existence for others. This process of temporal reconstruction wasn't just about healing from trauma. It was about resistance to genocide. By rebuilding their capacity to live in time, to remember the past, engage with the present, and plan for the future, Holocaust survivors were actively defeating the Nazi project of temporal destruction. The lessons of this temporal warfare extend far beyond Jewish experience during the Holocaust. They help us understand how oppression operates at the deepest psychological levels, how hatred can be weaponized through the manipulation of time and routine, and how resistance requires not just political action, but the preservation and reconstruction of the temporal practices that make human life meaningful. In 2025, as we face new forms of temporal manipulation through technology, social media, and economic systems that create chronic uncertainty and unpredictability, understanding these patterns becomes crucial for protecting human dignity and psychological health. The systematic assault on Jewish temporal existence during the Holocaust shows us that time itself can be a battlefield, that the ability to live predictably and plan for the future is not just a luxury, but a fundamental human need. It shows us that destroying people's temporal existence is a form of violence that can be as devastating as physical assault, and that protecting temporal dignity is essential for maintaining human community and resistance to oppression. As we continue to examine this overlooked dimension of Holocaust persecution, we begin to see how the Nazi understanding of temporal warfare was more sophisticated and devastating than most people realize. They didn't just want to kill Jewish bodies. They wanted to destroy Jewish temporal existence so completely that even survivors would be unable to rebuild their communities or challenge the Nazi narrative about Jewish inferiority. But they failed. Despite the systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence, despite the assault on memory, planning, routine, and hope, Jewish communities found ways to preserve and reconstruct their relationship with time. They maintained connections to their past, engaged meaningfully with their present, and invested courageously in their future. This temporal resilience wasn't just individual, it was collective. Jewish communities worked together to rebuild the temporal practices that make community life possible: shared rituals, regular gatherings, educational programs, cultural preservation efforts. They created new temporal traditions that honored their past while adapting to their changed circumstances. The recovery of Jewish temporal existence after the Holocaust required extraordinary courage because it meant choosing to trust in time again despite having experienced its systematic destruction. It meant choosing to make plans despite having learned that plans could be shattered without warning. It meant choosing to invest in routine despite having experienced the devastating consequences of temporal chaos. But this choice to re-engage with time was more than just personal healing. It was a form of resistance that continues to this day. Every Jewish family that observes traditional holidays, every Jewish institution that plans for the future, every Jewish community that preserves its history while adapting to contemporary challenges is actively defeating the Nazi project of temporal destruction. Understanding this temporal dimension of Holocaust persecution and recovery helps us recognize the full scope of what was attempted and what was resisted. It also helps us understand why protecting temporal dignity, people's right to remember their past, engage with their present, and plan for their future, is essential for maintaining human dignity and democratic values in any era. The Nazis understood that time is not neutral, that it can be weaponized, that destroying people's temporal existence is one of the most effective ways to destroy their humanity. But Holocaust survivors understood something equally important, that time can also be a tool of resistance, that rebuilding temporal existence is a way of rebuilding humanity, and that the courage to engage with time, despite its dangers, is fundamental to human flourishing and community survival. In 2025, as we face new challenges to temporal dignity and new forms of temporal manipulation, the lessons of this overlooked aspect of Holocaust history become more relevant than ever. Because protecting people's right to live meaningfully in time is not just about honoring the past. It's about ensuring that the patterns of temporal destruction that made genocide possible are recognized, resisted, and never allowed to take root again. The systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence during the Holocaust reveals something crucial about how hatred operates at the deepest levels of human experience. It shows us that genocide is not just about killing people, it's about destroying the temporal foundations that make human life meaningful and human community possible. And it shows us that the most effective resistance to such destruction is not just individual courage, but the collective commitment to preserving and rebuilding the temporal practices that connect us to our past, ground us in our present, and enable us to work together toward a more just and humane future. But there was another dimension to this temporal warfare that reveals perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Nazi psychological manipulation. They didn't just destroy Jewish time, they replaced it with something far more insidious. They created what historians now call administrative time, a bureaucratic temporal framework that was designed to consume Jewish mental and emotional energy while providing the illusion of agency and hope. This wasn't simply about making Jews fill out paperwork, though there was certainly plenty of that. This was about creating elaborate temporal mazes where Jewish families would spend months or years navigating bureaucratic processes that were deliberately designed to lead nowhere. It was about replacing the meaningful temporal rhythms of Jewish life with the empty, soul-crushing rhythms of administrative compliance. Consider the visa application process that consumed the lives of thousands of Jewish families trying to escape Nazi Germany. The paperwork requirements were staggering. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, police clearances, medical examinations, financial statements, character references, employment records, tax documents. Each document had to be obtained from a different office. Each office had different hours. Each process took weeks or months to complete. But here's the truly diabolical part. The requirements kept changing. Just as a family would complete one set of paperwork, new requirements would be announced. Documents that had taken months to obtain would suddenly be declared invalid, and need to be replaced with newer versions. Filing fees would increase without warning. Application deadlines would be moved up with only days of notice. The Goldstein family from Munich spent 18 months trying to obtain visas to emigrate to the United States. Sarah Goldstein later wrote, "We became full-time bureaucrats of our own desperation. Every day was consumed with standing in lines, filling out forms, waiting for appointments, gathering documents. We had no time to mourn what we were losing, no time to prepare emotionally for leaving, no time to maintain relationships or pursue meaningful activities. Our entire existence became about navigating a system that seemed designed to defeat us." This administrative time served multiple purposes. It kept Jewish families busy and distracted, preventing them from organizing resistance or helping other Jews escape. It created the illusion that escape was possible while making it practically impossible for most people to actually achieve. And perhaps most cruelly, it forced Jews to collaborate in their own temporal destruction by investing enormous amounts of energy in processes that were ultimately meaningless. Compare this to how bureaucratic systems are used today to exhaust and demoralize vulnerable populations. Immigration systems that require years of paperwork and legal proceedings for basic protections. Healthcare systems that force sick people to spend enormous amounts of time fighting for coverage. Educational loan systems that trap people in decades of administrative complexity. The specific contexts may be different, but the underlying principle remains the same. Create bureaucratic mazes that consume people's time and energy while providing minimal actual benefit. The genius of Nazi administrative time was that it made victims complicit in their own temporal destruction. Unlike other forms of persecution that could be clearly identified as oppression, administrative time felt like agency. People were doing something, taking action, working toward goals. The fact that these goals were largely unattainable was hidden behind layers of complexity and constantly changing requirements. Jewish families found themselves making impossible choices about how to allocate their limited time and resources. Should they focus on emigration paperwork or on maintaining their current living situation? Should they invest in language lessons for a country they might never reach or in immediate survival needs? Should they spend their savings on document fees or on food for their children? These weren't just practical decisions. They were temporal decisions that shaped how families experienced the passage of time. The constant pressure to make bureaucratic progress created a state of chronic temporal anxiety where every moment not spent on paperwork felt like a wasted opportunity, but every moment spent on paperwork felt like time stolen from actual living. Dr. Ruth Abrahamson, a psychologist who worked with refugees after the war, noted, "Many of my patients described feeling like they had lost years of their lives to Nazi bureaucracy. They had been so focused on navigating administrative requirements that they had stopped living in any meaningful sense. They had become temporal ghosts, existing only in relation to forms and deadlines and requirements that ultimately meant nothing." This administrative temporal destruction was particularly devastating for children and elderly family members. Children watched their parents become consumed with bureaucratic stress, unable to provide the attention and stability that children need. Elderly relatives found themselves excluded from family planning because their mobility limitations made them liabilities in bureaucratic processes that required constant travel between offices. The administrative maze also created artificial temporal hierarchies within Jewish communities. Families with more education, more money, or better connections could navigate the bureaucracy more effectively, creating resentment and competition where there should have been solidarity. The Nazis had succeeded in making Jews compete against each other for access to meaningless bureaucratic processes. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of administrative time was how it trained Jewish families to internalize bureaucratic thinking. People who had once organized their lives around meaningful relationships, creative work, and spiritual practices found themselves thinking primarily in terms of deadlines, requirements, and compliance. Their temporal imagination was being systematically retrained to accept bureaucratic logic as natural and inevitable. This bureaucratic temporal conditioning had long-term effects that extended far beyond the war itself. Many Holocaust survivors continued to experience anxiety around paperwork and official processes decades after liberation. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to expect bureaucratic persecution that routine administrative tasks could trigger intense emotional responses. The children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors often inherited this bureaucratic temporal anxiety. Many report feeling disproportionately stressed by routine paperwork, having difficulty trusting government agencies, experiencing panic when dealing with immigration authorities or tax offices. The administrative trauma of the Nazi period was passed down through generations, affecting families who had never directly experienced persecution. In 2025, we can see how administrative time continues to be used as a tool of control and exhaustion. The complexity of modern bureaucratic systems, from healthcare to immigration to education to social services, often seems designed to discourage people from accessing the benefits they're entitled to. The time and energy required to navigate these systems can be so overwhelming that many people simply give up, which may be precisely the intended effect. The specific technologies have evolved: online forms instead of paper ones, digital queues instead of physical lines, but the underlying principle remains the same. Create administrative complexity that consumes people's temporal resources while providing minimal actual benefit. The result is populations that are too exhausted by bureaucratic compliance to organize for political change or community building. Understanding how the Nazis used administrative time as a weapon helps us recognize when similar tactics are being used today. It also helps us understand why protecting people's right to meaningful temporal existence requires not just individual support, but systematic reform of the bureaucratic structures that can trap people in cycles of administrative compliance. The Nazi system of administrative time reveals something important about how oppression operates through the manipulation of daily experience. It shows us that people can be controlled not just through dramatic violence, but through the patient erosion of their temporal autonomy, their ability to organize their own time around their own priorities and values. The recovery of meaningful temporal existence after the Holocaust required not just healing from trauma, but learning to resist bureaucratic temporal control. Survivors had to rediscover how to organize their time around relationships, creativity, and spiritual practice, rather than compliance and survival. They had to rebuild their capacity to engage with time as a creative medium, rather than a bureaucratic constraint. They did this through community building, through religious observance, through artistic and cultural activities that reconnected them to meaningful temporal rhythms. They created new institutions that prioritized human relationships over administrative efficiency, that valued spiritual and emotional time over bureaucratic productivity. But perhaps most importantly, they taught their children and grandchildren to resist the temptation to organize their lives primarily around bureaucratic requirements. They modeled how to maintain meaningful temporal practices, even within systems that pressure people toward administrative compliance. This resistance to administrative temporal control wasn't just about personal healing. It was about preserving the capacity for human communities to organize themselves around values other than bureaucratic efficiency. It was about maintaining spaces where time could be experienced as sacred rather than administrative, creative rather than compliant. The lessons of Nazi administrative time extend far beyond Holocaust history. They help us understand how modern bureaucratic systems can be used to control and exhaust populations, how administrative complexity can serve political purposes beyond its stated goals, and how resistance to oppression requires not just political action, but the preservation of meaningful temporal practices. In our current era of increasing bureaucratic complexity, understanding these patterns becomes crucial for protecting human dignity and community autonomy. Because the ability to organize our time around our own values and relationships, rather than external administrative requirements, is fundamental to human freedom and flourishing. The systematic replacement of Jewish meaningful time with administrative time during the Holocaust shows us that temporal control can be more subtle and more devastating than direct violence. It shows us that people can be destroyed not just by taking away their time, but by filling their time with meaningless activities that prevent them from engaging in the relationships and practices that give life meaning. And it shows us that the most effective resistance to such temporal control is the conscious cultivation of meaningful temporal practices, the rituals, relationships, and creative activities that connect us to what matters most, that ground us in community, and that enable us to experience time as a gift rather than a burden. As we examine this overlooked dimension of Holocaust persecution, we begin to see how the Nazi assault on Jewish temporal existence was more comprehensive and sophisticated than most people realize. They didn't just want to kill Jewish people, they wanted to destroy the very possibility of meaningful Jewish temporal existence, to ensure that even survivors would be so temporally damaged that they couldn't rebuild authentic communities or challenge the Nazi narrative about Jewish worth. But they failed, because human beings have an extraordinary capacity to rediscover meaningful time, even after it has been systematically destroyed. Holocaust survivors found ways to rebuild their temporal practices, to reconnect with the rhythms that give life meaning, to create new traditions that honored their past while adapting to their changed circumstances. This temporal resilience offers hope for our own era, as we face new forms of temporal manipulation and control. It shows us that the human capacity for meaningful time can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it, and that the work of rebuilding temporal dignity is both possible and essential for maintaining human community and resistance to oppression. The Nazi understanding of temporal warfare was sophisticated, but their victims' understanding of temporal resilience was even more powerful, and that resilience continues to offer lessons for anyone who seeks to protect human dignity and meaningful community in the face of systems that would reduce people to administrative units or bureaucratic compliance. In 2025, as we navigate our own complex bureaucratic systems and temporal pressures, the example of Holocaust survivors who rebuilt meaningful time from the ruins of administrative control reminds us that temporal dignity is not just a luxury, but a necessity for human flourishing, and that protecting and cultivating meaningful temporal practices is one of the most important forms of resistance we can offer to systems that would control and diminish human experience. The story of how the Nazis destroyed Jewish time and how Jewish communities rebuilt it is ultimately a story about the human capacity to find meaning and create community even under the most oppressive circumstances. It's a story that continues to unfold today as people around the world work to protect temporal dignity and resist the forces that would reduce human experience to bureaucratic compliance or administrative efficiency. And it's a story that reminds us that time itself is not neutral, that it can be weaponized or liberated, that it can be used to control or to heal, and that the struggle for temporal dignity is ultimately the struggle for human dignity itself. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this temporal destruction was how the Nazis transformed Jewish sacred time into a weapon against Jewish communities themselves. They didn't simply ban Jewish holidays and religious observances. They corrupted them, turning the very calendar that had sustained Jewish identity for millennia into a source of terror and division. Consider the twisted genius of this approach. In 2025, we understand how deeply our sense of identity is connected to the rhythms of celebration and commemoration that mark our year. Think about how Christmas shapes Christian temporal experience, how Ramadan organizes Muslim community life, how birthday celebrations anchor personal identity in family time. These aren't just social customs, they're temporal anchors that give meaning to the passage of time and connect individuals to larger communities and traditions. The Nazis understood this intimately. They recognized that simply forbidding Jewish holidays would create martyrs and strengthen Jewish resolve. Instead, they systematically perverted these sacred occasions, turning them into sources of fear, guilt, and community fracture. Take Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a time of fasting, reflection, and communal atonement. In occupied territories, the Nazis would schedule major deportations, selections, and executions specifically on Yom Kippur. Jewish families found themselves facing impossible choices. Observe their most sacred day and risk being caught in raids, or abandon their spiritual obligations to focus on survival. But the cruelty went deeper than timing coincidence. Nazi administrators would offer Jewish communities false choices on religious holidays. They might announce that a certain number of people needed to be selected for work assignments on Rosh Hashanah, but that the community could choose who would go. Suddenly, the Jewish New Year became a day when Jewish leaders had to decide which members of their community to sacrifice. Sarah Kahn, a survivor from Warsaw, later wrote, "They made our holiest days into days of betrayal. Instead of coming together to pray and celebrate, we were forced to choose who among us would be taken away. The holidays that should have brought us closer to God and to each other became the days when we lost our faith in both." This transformation of sacred time into terror time was psychologically devastating in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Religious holidays serve crucial psychological functions. They provide hope for the future, connection to the past, and a sense of meaning that transcends immediate circumstances. When these temporal anchors are corrupted, people lose not just their religious practice, but their fundamental orientation in time and meaning. The Nazis also weaponized Jewish sacred time by creating fake celebrations designed to humiliate and demoralize Jewish communities. In some ghettos, they would force Jews to participate in mock religious ceremonies where traditional prayers were replaced with Nazi propaganda, where sacred texts were burned as part of the celebration, where religious leaders were forced to perform blasphemous acts in front of their congregations. These forced corruptions of Jewish sacred time served multiple purposes. They broke down religious authority by forcing respected leaders to participate in sacrilege. They created shame and confusion about Jewish identity by associating it with humiliation and betrayal. And they destroyed the temporal rhythms that had organized Jewish community life for generations. Compare this to how sacred time is attacked in contemporary contexts. We see authoritarian regimes that schedule political events to conflict with religious observances, forcing communities to choose between their spiritual obligations and their civic participation. We see commercial pressures that make it difficult for people to maintain religious or cultural temporal practices because of work schedules or economic demands. But the Nazi corruption of Jewish sacred time was more systematic and more psychologically sophisticated than these contemporary examples. They understood that destroying the positive associations people had with their own temporal traditions was more devastating than simply preventing those traditions from being observed. Jewish children who survived this period often reported that they could never again experience Jewish holidays without anxiety and fear. The temporal celebrations that should have been sources of joy and community connection had been so thoroughly associated with danger and trauma that they remained psychological triggers decades after liberation. Rachel Goldberg, who was 7 when the war began, later wrote, "Even 50 years later, when my own grandchildren light Hanukkah candles, I feel a panic in my chest. The beautiful traditions that my grandmother taught me had been turned into signals of danger. We learned to fear our own calendar, to dread the approach of days that should have been celebrations." This corruption of sacred time also created lasting divisions within Jewish communities. When communities were forced to make impossible choices on religious holidays, when sacred occasions became associated with betrayal and selection, the social bonds that religious observance was supposed to strengthen were instead severed. Families found themselves unable to celebrate together because different members had made different choices during the war. Communities couldn't rebuild their religious practices because the holidays themselves had become sources of trauma and conflict. The temporal traditions that should have helped people heal and reconnect after liberation had been so thoroughly corrupted that they became barriers to community rebuilding. The Nazi understanding of how to corrupt sacred time reveals something important about the relationship between temporal experience and human identity. They recognized that people's sense of who they are is deeply connected to the rhythms of celebration and commemoration that mark their lives. Destroy those rhythms, and you destroy people's ability to maintain coherent identity across time. This temporal corruption was particularly devastating for Jewish children, who were at crucial developmental stages when they should have been learning to associate their cultural identity with positive temporal experiences. Instead, they learned to associate being Jewish with danger, humiliation, and impossible moral choices. Many child survivors reported that they spent decades trying to reclaim positive associations with Jewish identity and temporal practice. They had to learn, as adults, to experience Jewish holidays as celebrations rather than threats, to see Jewish community gathering as sources of strength rather than targets for persecution. The process of reclaiming corrupted sacred time after the Holocaust required enormous courage and creativity. Survivors had to rebuild positive associations with temporal practices that had been systematically perverted. They had to create new traditions that honored their heritage while acknowledging the trauma that had become associated with traditional observances. Some survivors chose to abandon religious practice entirely, unable to separate it from the terror and corruption they had experienced. Others threw themselves into religious observance with renewed intensity, determined to reclaim their sacred time from those who had tried to destroy it. Still others created hybrid practices that incorporated both traditional elements and new approaches designed to address the specific trauma they had experienced. Dr. Abraham Klausner, a rabbi who worked with displaced persons after the war, noted, "Many survivors wanted to observe Jewish holidays, but found themselves overwhelmed with anxiety when they tried. We had to develop new approaches that honored tradition while acknowledging trauma. We created abbreviated services, modified prayers, and community gatherings that could accommodate people whose relationship with sacred time had been damaged." The rebuilding of Jewish sacred time wasn't just about individual healing, it was about community reconstruction. Jewish communities had to learn how to celebrate together again, how to mark time collectively in ways that created connection rather than division, how to honor their past while building sustainable futures. This process required acknowledging that the Nazi corruption of sacred time had created lasting changes in how Jewish communities related to their own traditions. It wasn't possible to simply return to pre-war practices as if nothing had happened. The trauma had to be integrated into new forms of temporal observance that could hold both celebration and mourning, hope and memory. In contemporary contexts, we can see how the corruption of sacred time continues to be used as a tool of oppression. Religious minorities around the world face pressures that make it difficult or dangerous to observe their temporal traditions. Commercial and political systems often ignore or actively undermine the sacred time practices that give communities meaning and identity. Understanding how the Nazis weaponized Jewish sacred time helps us recognize these patterns when they emerge in contemporary contexts. It also helps us understand why protecting people's right to observe their own temporal traditions is fundamental to maintaining human dignity and community coherence. The systematic corruption of Jewish sacred time during the Holocaust shows us that oppression operates not just through violence and exclusion, but through the perversion of the very practices that give people meaning and identity. It shows us that destroying people's positive relationship with their own temporal traditions can be more devastating than simply preventing those traditions from being observed. But it also shows us the extraordinary resilience of human communities in rebuilding temporal meaning even after it has been systematically corrupted. The Jewish communities that emerged after the Holocaust created new ways of marking sacred time that honored their past while acknowledging their trauma, that celebrated their survival while mourning their losses. These rebuilt temporal practices weren't just about religious observance. They were about resistance to the Nazi project of temporal destruction. Every Jewish family that gathered for Sabbath dinner, every community that celebrated holidays together, every individual who chose to mark sacred time despite having been taught to fear it, was actively defeating the Nazi attempt to corrupt Jewish temporal existence. The lessons of this sacred time corruption extend far beyond Jewish experience during the Holocaust. They help us understand how oppression operates through the manipulation of meaning itself, how hatred can be weaponized through the perversion of the practices that give people identity and community connection. In 2025, as we face new challenges to religious freedom and cultural practice, understanding these patterns becomes crucial for protecting the temporal traditions that give diverse communities meaning and coherence. Because the right to mark sacred time according to one's own traditions and values is not just about religious freedom. It's about the fundamental human right to create meaning through temporal practice. The Nazi corruption of Jewish sacred time reminds us that time itself can be a battlefield where struggles over identity, meaning, and community play out. It shows us that protecting sacred time requires not just legal guarantees, but active resistance to forces that would corrupt or commodify the temporal practices that make human life meaningful. And it shows us that the work of rebuilding meaningful temporal practices after they have been corrupted is both possible and essential for human flourishing. The Jewish communities that reconstructed their sacred time after the Holocaust offer a model for how people can reclaim temporal dignity even after it has been systematically attacked. Their example reminds us that sacred time is not just about individual spiritual practice, but about community resilience, that the ability to mark time collectively according to shared values and traditions is fundamental to human social existence, and that protecting and rebuilding sacred time is one of the most important forms of resistance to oppression. As we continue to examine this overlooked dimension of Holocaust persecution, we see how the Nazi assault on Jewish temporal existence was designed not just to kill Jewish people, but to destroy the very possibility of meaningful Jewish temporal experience. They wanted to ensure that even if some Jews survived physically, they would be so temporally damaged that they could never rebuild coherent communities or maintain authentic connections to their heritage. But they failed because the human capacity for sacred time, for meaningful temporal practice, for community celebration and commemoration proved stronger than even the most systematic attempts to corrupt and destroy it. And that capacity continues to offer hope and guidance for anyone who seeks to protect temporal dignity and meaningful community in the face of forces that would reduce human experience to mere survival or compliance. The story of how Jewish sacred time was corrupted and then rebuilt reveals something fundamental about human resilience and the power of temporal practice to sustain identity and community even under the most oppressive circumstances. It's a story that continues to unfold today as communities around the world work to protect their sacred time practices and rebuild temporal meaning in the face of various forms of cultural and political pressure. And it's a story that reminds us that the struggle for temporal dignity is ultimately about the right to be human in the fullest sense, to mark time according to our deepest values, to celebrate our connections to each other and to the sacred, and to pass on meaningful temporal traditions to future generations who will carry them forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence reveals its most haunting dimension when we examine how the Nazis manipulated the concept of waiting itself. In our world today, waiting is an inconvenience. We wait for traffic lights, for downloads, for coffee to brew. We have apps that tell us exactly how long our food delivery will take, GPS systems that calculate arrival times to the minute. Waiting, in 2025, is temporary and predictable. But the Nazis transformed waiting into a form of psychological torture that could last for years. They created what historians now call eternal liminal time, a state where Jewish families existed permanently between hope and despair, between departure and arrival, between life and death. This wasn't just about making people wait in lines, though that was certainly part of it. This was about trapping entire populations in a temporal purgatory where time itself became meaningless. Consider the experience of the Rosenberg family in Vienna. In 1938, they received word that their American visa application was being processed. They were told to prepare for departure within 6 months. They sold their furniture, closed their business, said goodbye to friends, packed their belongings. 6 months became 12, 12 became 18. For 3 years, they lived in a state of permanent preparation to leave, never able to settle into their restricted Austrian life because departure seemed imminent, never able to actually depart because the promises were always just out of reach. Mrs. Rosenberg later wrote, "We lived in our suitcases for 3 years. We couldn't buy new clothes because we were leaving next month. We couldn't make new friends because we were leaving next week. We couldn't plant a garden because we were leaving tomorrow. We existed in a constant state of almost departure that made it impossible to live in any meaningful way." This manipulation of waiting time served multiple psychological purposes. It prevented Jewish families from settling into resistance or acceptance. People who believe they're about to leave don't invest energy in organizing opposition or building community support networks. It created a state of chronic anxiety that was more psychologically damaging than either hope or despair would have been alone, and it made victims complicit in their own temporal destruction by forcing them to invest enormous emotional energy in possibilities that were systematically designed to remain just out of reach. The genius of this temporal manipulation was that it felt voluntary. Unlike other forms of persecution that were obviously imposed from outside, the experience of waiting felt like choice. Families convinced themselves that if they just waited a little longer, filled out one more form, paid one more fee, provided one more document, their departure would finally be approved. The fact that the system was designed to ensure that this moment never arrived was hidden behind layers of bureaucratic complexity and false hope. Compare this to how waiting is weaponized today against vulnerable populations. Immigration systems that keep asylum seekers in legal limbo for years, never knowing when their cases will be decided. Healthcare systems that force sick people to wait months for treatments that could be provided immediately. Educational and employment systems that create endless qualification requirements that always seem to need just one more credential. The specific context may be different, but the underlying principle remains the same. Trap people in temporal limbo, where they cannot move forward, but also cannot give up hope, where their entire existence becomes organized around waiting for something that may never come. The Nazi manipulation of waiting time was particularly cruel because it exploited one of humanity's most fundamental psychological needs, the need to believe that suffering is temporary, that things will get better, that persistence and compliance will eventually be rewarded. They took this basic human hope and turned it into a weapon that kept people passive and compliant while their situations gradually worsened. Jewish families found themselves making increasingly desperate compromises to maintain their position in various waiting systems. They would sell family heirlooms to pay new fees that were suddenly required. They would accept increasingly restrictive living conditions because they believed departure was imminent. They would abandon family members who couldn't meet new requirements because they believed they could send for them later. Each compromise was rationalized as temporary, as a necessary sacrifice to achieve the ultimate goal of escape. But the Nazis understood that people who become accustomed to making compromises in the name of future reward often lose their ability to recognize when they're being systematically exploited. The psychological impact of this weaponized waiting was devastating for children, who were at developmental stages when they needed stability and predictability to form healthy identities. Jewish children during this period often grew up without any sense of home or belonging, always preparing to leave, never able to invest emotionally in their current circumstances. Michael Stern, who was 10 when his family began waiting for visas to leave Germany, later wrote, "I never learned how to be anywhere. We were always about to go somewhere else, so I never developed attachments to places or people or routines. Even as an adult, I struggle with commitment because I learned so early that everything is temporary, that you should always be ready to leave at a moment's notice." This childhood experience of weaponized waiting often created lasting psychological patterns. Many children of families trapped in temporal limbo developed what psychologists now recognize as chronic departure anxiety, an inability to feel settled anywhere, a constant sense that they should be preparing to leave, a difficulty forming deep attachments because they had learned that departure was always imminent. The manipulation of waiting time also created artificial hierarchies within Jewish communities. Families who had been waiting longer often felt superior to those who had just begun the process. People who had managed to obtain certain documents or approvals would hoard information rather than sharing it, believing that helping others might somehow jeopardize their own chances. The Nazis had succeeded in turning the shared experience of persecution into a source of competition and division. Instead of creating solidarity among Jewish families facing similar circumstances, the waiting systems created resentment, jealousy, and isolation. Dr. Hannah Arendt, writing about this period, noted, "The genius of totalitarian systems is not just that they destroy people's present circumstances, but that they corrupt people's relationship with time itself. When waiting becomes a way of life, when hope becomes a form of torture, when the future becomes a weapon used against the present, people lose their capacity to live meaningfully in any temporal framework." The long-term consequences of this temporal manipulation extended far beyond the war itself. Holocaust survivors often struggled with decision-making and commitment long after liberation. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that any situation was temporary, that any decision might need to be reversed at a moment's notice, that they found it difficult to make the kind of long-term commitments that normal life requires. Many survivors reported feeling anxious whenever they had to wait for anything, even routine appointments or transportation. The experience of waiting had become so thoroughly associated with danger and disappointment that even ordinary delays could trigger intense emotional responses. The children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors often inherited this anxiety around waiting and commitment. Many report feeling uncomfortable making long-term plans, having difficulty with processes that require patience and persistence, experiencing panic when faced with bureaucratic delays or administrative uncertainty. In contemporary contexts, we can see how the weaponization of waiting continues to be used against various populations. The specific methods have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains the same. Create temporal limbo, where people cannot move forward, but also cannot abandon hope, where their entire existence becomes organized around waiting for relief that may never come. Understanding how the Nazis used waiting as a psychological weapon helps us recognize when similar tactics are being used today. It also helps us understand why protecting people's right to temporal certainty and predictable processes is fundamental to maintaining human dignity and psychological health. The systematic manipulation of waiting time during the Holocaust shows us that time itself can be weaponized, that the human need for hope and progress can be turned into a tool of oppression. It shows us that destroying people's ability to live meaningfully in the present by trapping them in endless preparation for a future that never arrives is a form of violence that can be as devastating as physical assault. But it also shows us the extraordinary resilience of human beings in finding ways to create meaning, even while trapped in temporal limbo. Many Jewish families found ways to maintain their humanity and dignity despite being caught in systems designed to destroy both. They created small rituals and practices that honored the present moment, even while preparing for an uncertain future. They maintained relationships and cultural practices even while living in suitcases. They found ways to hope without becoming enslaved by hope. The recovery of meaningful time after liberation required learning to live in the present again, to make commitments despite uncertainty, to invest emotional energy in current circumstances, rather than constantly preparing for departure. This wasn't just about individual healing. It was about rebuilding the capacity for normal human temporal experience. Holocaust survivors did this by creating new homes, where they could finally unpack their suitcases and stay. They did it by having children and planting gardens and making long-term plans, despite having learned how quickly such plans could be shattered. They did it by choosing to trust in the possibility of stability, even after experiencing the most systematic destruction of temporal security. This process of temporal recovery wasn't just about personal healing. It was about resistance to the Nazi project of temporal destruction. Every survivor who learned to live in the present again, who made long-term commitments despite past betrayals, who chose to invest in current circumstances rather than constantly preparing for escape, was actively defeating the Nazi manipulation of waiting time. The lessons of this weaponized waiting extend far beyond Holocaust history. They help us understand how oppression operates through the manipulation of hope itself, how systems can be designed to trap people in temporal limbo that prevents them from living meaningfully in any time frame. In 2025, as we face new forms of temporal manipulation through technology, bureaucracy, and economic systems that create chronic uncertainty and endless preparation for futures that may never arrive, understanding these patterns becomes crucial for protecting human temporal dignity. The Nazi manipulation of waiting time reminds us that the right to live meaningfully in the present, rather than being trapped in endless preparation for an uncertain future, is fundamental to human psychological health and community stability. It shows us that protecting people from temporal exploitation requires not just individual support, but systematic reform of the processes and institutions that can trap people in cycles of endless waiting. And it shows us that the courage to live fully in the present moment, despite uncertainty about the future, is one of the most important forms of resistance to systems that would control people through the manipulation of hope and time itself. As we continue to examine this overlooked dimension of Holocaust persecution, we see how the Nazi assault on Jewish temporal existence was designed to destroy not just Jewish lives, but Jewish capacity to live meaningfully in time. They wanted to create a population so temporally damaged that even survivors would be unable to rebuild normal relationships with past, present, and future. But they failed because the human capacity for meaningful temporal experience, for living fully in the present while maintaining hope for the future, proved stronger than even the most sophisticated attempts to manipulate and destroy it. And that capacity continues to offer guidance for anyone who seeks to protect temporal dignity and meaningful life in the face of systems that would reduce human existence to endless waiting for relief that may never come. The story of how waiting was weaponized during the Holocaust, and how survivors learned to reclaim their relationship with time and hope, offers crucial insights for our own era of temporal manipulation and bureaucratic control. It reminds us that the struggle for temporal dignity is ultimately about the right to live fully human lives, grounded in meaningful present experience, while maintaining healthy relationships with both memory and hope. The systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence reached its final, most devastating form in what Nazi administrators coldly documented as memory liquidation protocols. This wasn't just about destroying records or burning books, though those actions were certainly part of the larger plan. This was about eliminating the very capacity for Jewish memory to exist across generations, ensuring that even if some Jews survived physically, their connection to their own history would be so thoroughly severed that they could never rebuild coherent communities or maintain authentic Jewish identity. In 2025, we understand how crucial intergenerational memory transmission is to human community survival. We know that cultures persist not just through written records, but through the stories grandparents tell grandchildren. the recipes passed down through families, the songs learned at kitchen tables, the explanations of traditions shared during quiet moments between generations. We recognize that when these informal channels of memory transmission are disrupted, entire ways of life can disappear within a single generation. The Nazis understood this with chilling clarity. They developed systematic protocols for separating Jewish children from their elderly relatives, recognizing that grandparents and great-grandparents were the primary carriers of Jewish cultural memory, the living libraries of community history, tradition, and identity. But the separation wasn't just physical. Nazi psychologists developed sophisticated techniques for making Jewish children distrust and reject the memories and stories of their own families. Children were taught that their grandparents' stories about Jewish history were lies designed to make Jews feel important. They were told that their parents' explanations of Jewish traditions were superstitions that prevented Jews from integrating into modern society. They were convinced that their own memories of family celebrations and community gatherings were false or exaggerated. Consider the case of young David Goldman in Prague. Before 1939, he had spent every Friday evening at his grandmother's house, learning the prayers and songs that had sustained his family for generations. His grandmother would tell him stories about their ancestors, explain the meaning behind various Jewish customs, teach him the Hebrew prayers that connected him to thousands of years of Jewish tradition. By 1941, David was forbidden from visiting his grandmother, who had been moved to segregated housing. When he asked his parents about the stories she had told him, they would quickly change the subject, too frightened to discuss anything that might be seen as Jewish indoctrination. When he tried to remember the songs she had taught him, Nazi-trained teachers would interrupt and explain that these were primitive chants that held back intellectual development. David later wrote, "They didn't just take away my grandmother, they convinced me that everything she had taught me was worthless, that the stories she told were fantasies, that the songs she sang were meaningless noise. By the time I was 12, I was ashamed of my own memories, embarrassed by the traditions that had once made me feel connected to something larger than myself." This systematic corruption of intergenerational memory was applied across occupied Europe with devastating effectiveness. Jewish children were taught to see their own cultural inheritance as primitive, backward, and embarrassing. They learned to distance themselves from the very traditions and stories that might have sustained them through the persecution they were experiencing. The psychological impact was devastating not just for the children, but for the elderly relatives who watched their cultural legacy being rejected and forgotten. Grandparents who had survived pogroms, economic hardship, and social persecution throughout their lives found themselves watching their own grandchildren turn away from the traditions they had sacrificed everything to preserve. Sarah Rosenbaum, an elderly woman in Warsaw, wrote in her diary, "My grandson David came to visit yesterday. When I tried to teach him the blessing over bread, he told me that his teacher said those words were backwards thinking that would make it harder for him to succeed in the modern world. I watched my own grandchild reject the prayers that have sustained our family through centuries of hardship, and I realized they had found a way to kill our future even while we still breathe." The Nazis paired this corruption of family memory with the systematic destruction of community memory institutions. Jewish schools weren't just closed, their libraries were seized and their records destroyed. Synagogues weren't just shuttered, their historical documents were confiscated and their archives burned. Community centers weren't just abandoned, their photographs, membership records, and cultural artifacts were deliberately eliminated. But perhaps most cruelly, the Nazis replaced authentic Jewish memory with fabricated counter-narratives designed to make Jews ashamed of their own history. Jewish children were shown falsified documents proving that Jewish communities had always been parasitic, that Jewish traditions were stolen from other cultures, that Jewish contributions to society had been exaggerated or invented entirely. These weren't obviously false propaganda materials that children could easily reject. They were sophisticated forgeries that included just enough real historical information to seem credible, that exploited normal uncertainties and gaps in family knowledge, that appeared to be objective scholarly research rather than deliberate misinformation. The long-term impact of this memory liquidation extended far beyond the war itself. Many Holocaust survivors found themselves unable to pass on Jewish traditions to their own children because they had been taught to doubt the authenticity and value of those traditions. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to see Jewish cultural memory as unreliable or worthless that they couldn't trust their own knowledge enough to transmit it confidently. Dr. Eva Hoffman, a researcher who studied Holocaust survivor families in the 1960s, noted, "Many survivors wanted to share their cultural heritage with their children, but found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty. They had been taught to question their own memories, to doubt the stories their parents had told them, to see Jewish traditions as potentially false or harmful. They couldn't give their children what they themselves had been convinced was worthless." This intergenerational transmission trauma created lasting gaps in Jewish cultural continuity that persist to this day. Many Jewish families lost not just specific traditions, but the confidence to maintain and adapt Jewish practices across changing circumstances. The organic process of cultural evolution that had allowed Jewish communities to survive and thrive for millennia was disrupted by the systematic destruction of memory transmission channels. In contemporary contexts, we can see echoes of these memory liquidation tactics in various forms around the world. Indigenous communities facing cultural assimilation programs that separate children from their elders and traditional knowledge. Immigrant families struggling to maintain cultural connections across generations in societies that devalue their heritage. Religious minorities whose traditional practices are systematically marginalized or misrepresented in educational systems. The specific methods may have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains the same. Disrupt the transmission of cultural memory across generations, and you can destroy communities without having to kill every individual member. Make people ashamed of their own heritage, and they will collaborate in their own cultural extinction. Understanding how the Nazis used memory liquidation as a weapon of genocide helps us recognize when similar tactics are being used today. It also helps us understand why protecting intergenerational memory transmission is fundamental to maintaining cultural diversity and human dignity. The systematic assault on Jewish memory during the Holocaust shows us that genocide operates not just through physical violence, but through the destruction of the cultural knowledge that makes communities possible across time. It shows us that the capacity to remember and transmit heritage across generations is not just a cultural luxury, but a fundamental requirement for human community survival. But it also shows us the extraordinary resilience of human memory and the power of even partially preserved cultural knowledge to rebuild community identity across generations. Many Holocaust survivors found ways to reconstruct Jewish traditions and practices even after their memory transmission had been systematically disrupted. They created new approaches to Jewish education and cultural preservation that acknowledged the gaps and trauma while still maintaining essential connections to Jewish heritage. The recovery of Jewish memory after the Holocaust required tremendous courage and creativity. Survivors had to learn to trust their own cultural knowledge again, to validate their own memories and experiences, to rebuild confidence in the value and authenticity of Jewish traditions. They had to find ways to transmit cultural heritage to their children, while acknowledging the trauma and disruption that had affected their own relationship with that heritage. They did this through Holocaust education programs that preserve testimony and historical documentation. They did it through Jewish cultural organizations that created new ways of teaching and maintaining traditions. They did it through community gathering places where different generations could share knowledge and experiences across the gaps created by persecution. But perhaps most importantly, they did it by choosing to remember and share their stories despite having been taught that those stories were worthless or false. Every survivor who spoke about their experiences, every family that maintained Jewish practices, despite uncertainty about their authenticity, every community that worked to preserve and transmit Jewish culture across generations, was actively defeating the Nazi project of memory liquidation. The lessons of this memory warfare extend far beyond Jewish experience during the Holocaust. They help us understand how oppression operates through the destruction of cultural knowledge, how hatred can be weaponized through the corruption of intergenerational memory transmission, and how resistance requires not just political action, but the conscious preservation and sharing of cultural heritage across generations. In 2025, as we face new challenges to cultural preservation and intergenerational knowledge transmission through technological change, social fragmentation, and various forms of cultural pressure, understanding these patterns becomes crucial for protecting human diversity and community continuity. The Nazi assault on Jewish memory reminds us that the right to remember and transmit our heritage across generations is not just about cultural preservation, but about fundamental human dignity. It shows us that protecting intergenerational memory transmission requires active effort and conscious resistance to forces that would disconnect us from our own cultural knowledge and community history. And it shows us that the courage to remember and share our stories, despite uncertainty and trauma, is one of the most important forms of resistance to systems that would control people through the destruction of cultural memory and community identity. As we conclude this examination of the overlooked temporal dimensions of Holocaust persecution, we see how the Nazi assault on Jewish time was designed not just to kill Jewish people, but to destroy the very possibility of Jewish temporal existence across generations. They wanted to ensure that, even if some Jews survived physically, they would be so temporally and culturally damaged that they could never rebuild authentic communities or maintain genuine connections to their heritage. But they failed. Despite the systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence, despite the assault on memory, routine, hope, and cultural transmission, Jewish communities found ways to preserve and rebuild their relationship with time. They maintained connections to their past, even when those connections had been systematically corrupted. They engaged meaningfully with their present circumstances, even when those circumstances were designed to prevent meaningful engagement. And they invested courageously in their future, even when they had been taught that Jewish futures were impossible. This temporal resilience wasn't just individual, it was collective. Jewish communities worked together to rebuild the temporal practices that make community life possible: shared rituals, regular gatherings, educational programs, cultural preservation efforts, memory transmission channels. They created new temporal traditions that honored their past while acknowledging their trauma, that celebrated their survival while mourning their losses. The recovery of Jewish temporal existence after the Holocaust required extraordinary courage, because it meant choosing to trust in time again, despite having experienced its systematic destruction. It meant choosing to make plans, despite having learned that plans could be shattered without warning. It meant choosing to invest in routine, despite having experienced the devastating consequences of temporal chaos. It meant choosing to preserve and transmit cultural memory, despite having been taught that such memory was worthless or false. But this choice to re-engage with time was more than just personal healing. It was a form of resistance that continues to this day. Every Jewish family that observes traditional holidays, every Jewish institution that plans for the future, every Jewish community that preserves its history while adapting to contemporary challenges, every Jewish person who shares family stories and cultural knowledge with the next generation is actively defeating the Nazi project of temporal destruction. Understanding this temporal dimension of Holocaust persecution and recovery helps us recognize the full scope of what was attempted and what was resisted. It also helps us understand why protecting temporal dignity, people's right to remember their past, engage with their present, and plan for their future according to their own values and traditions, is essential for maintaining human dignity and democratic values in any era. The Nazis understood that time is not neutral, that it can be weaponized, that destroying people's temporal existence is one of the most effective ways to destroy their humanity. But Holocaust survivors understood something equally important, that time can also be a tool of resistance, that rebuilding temporal existence is a way of rebuilding humanity, and that the courage to engage with time, despite its dangers, is fundamental to human flourishing and community survival. In 2025, as we face new challenges to temporal dignity and new forms of temporal manipulation through technology, bureaucracy, and systems that create chronic uncertainty and meaninglessness, the lessons of this overlooked aspect of Holocaust history become more relevant than ever. Because protecting people's right to live meaningfully in time is not just about honoring the past. It's about ensuring that the patterns of temporal destruction that made genocide possible are recognized, resisted, and never allowed to take root again. The systematic destruction of Jewish temporal existence during the Holocaust reveals something crucial about how hatred operates at the deepest levels of human experience. It shows us that genocide is not just about killing people. It's about destroying the temporal foundations that make human life meaningful and human community possible across generations. And it shows us that the most effective resistance to such destruction is not just individual courage, but the collective commitment to preserving and rebuilding the temporal practices that connect us to our past, ground us in our present, and enable us to work together toward a more just and humane future. Because in the end, the struggle for temporal dignity is the struggle for human dignity itself, and protecting our right to exist meaningfully in time is protecting our right to be fully human. The story of how Jewish temporal existence was systematically destroyed and courageously rebuilt reminds us that time itself is a battlefield where struggles over identity, meaning, and community play out. It shows us that the courage to remember, to hope, to celebrate, to mourn, to plan, and to transmit our heritage across generations is not just personally fulfilling, but politically essential for maintaining the foundations of human dignity and democratic community. And as we face the challenges of our own era, the example of those who refuse to let their temporal existence be destroyed offers both warning and hope. Warning about how quickly and systematically the foundations of meaningful time can be attacked, and hope about how powerfully they can be defended and rebuilt by people who refuse to surrender their humanity, even under the most oppressive circumstances. Their resistance continues in every moment we choose to live meaningfully in time, to honor our past while engaging with our present, to build communities that can sustain themselves across generations, and to protect the temporal dignity that makes human flourishing possible. Because the most important lesson of this overlooked aspect of Holocaust history is not just that temporal destruction was attempted, but that temporal resilience proved stronger, and that this resilience remains available to us today as we work to build a world where every person can live with dignity in time,